All right, from practice to performance. Assessment. It's the most important thing, right? Normally I have these learning targets for a session, but I thought this time there's just so much to talk about. I'm not going to have a learning, we're just going to say we're going to talk about all of these things at some point, somehow. And your level of understanding and all different. I know a lot of you people, and some of you guys are experts, and some people have dealt with this, some of you haven't maybe. But we're going to talk about all these things because in my mind it is the most important thing. I used to be a district supervisor for language teachers, and I always told my teachers, I couldn't care less how you teach. Didn't matter to me. We never talked about strategies. We never talked about activities. If you think that standing on your head and singing the alphabet while clapping rhythmically works for your kids, knock yourself out. But the one thing I expect that my teachers do is to agree on assessments. If you can produce results, that's all that matters, right? So for me, it was always the assessment. And of course, I was lying to the teachers because I knew if we were changing the assessments, I also knew that we were going to change the way they teach. But of course, I didn't tell them that. So to me, assessment is the most important thing that we can talk about. The presentation today is kind of, it's something new I've been just kind of thinking about when it comes to assessment. Because we keep talking about it, we keep throwing words out and buzzwords and make people identify them in templates, but how do all the pieces actually connect together? Because at the end of the day, the teacher does want to know, what do I have to do? How do I get them ready for the assessment or whatever it is, right? So to get us started, I thought we have you guys, have you guys a little chat. And here's your first little task. So I want you to, you can do it at your table or to a neighbor, turn to a neighbor and talk about, have a little short and very honest chat about assessment in your program. What's the role of assessment? What does the process look like right now? And here's my leading question already for you. Discuss how you can ensure that assessment is not a gotcha, but rather a celebration of work. And I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes for that conversation. Go. So lots of interesting conversations, lots of stories from programs, and also lots of buzzwords too, right? Because sometimes when we talk about these programs and we talk about education, we like to use lots of words, especially when it comes to assessment. And so, of course, I heard these kind of words. I heard formative assessments from some people, and I heard summative assessments, and we keep talking about assessment, and I'm not sure I like that word. I mean, it starts with 3 bad letters. And if you saw on the website, I was really worried because they abbreviated did you notice that? The session title? It says from practice to formative, putting an AS, and I was like, oh, thank God it was just 2 letters, not 3. So it's not a good word when we're talking about student learning, right? Kids used to have test anxiety, didn't they? That was the bad thing. Kids have test anxiety, and then we weren't allowed to use the word tests anymore. And so now we're using the word assessment. And what do kids have now? Assessment anxiety, exactly, because nothing has really changed. We just used a new word. And now assessment has become this bad thing. And now when you tell students, oh, you're going to have an assessment, they get all nervous about it. And so maybe you should just stop talking about assessment and really talk about what does it really mean. And in my mind, when we're talking about assessment in a language classroom, we're really just talking about 2 things, right? We're talking about performance and feedback. The performance, what can the students do? How can they demonstrate what they can do with what they know? And demonstrate it to themselves and demonstrate it to you, the instructor. And then what kind of feedback are they getting? Either feedback from you, feedback from themselves, feedback from a peer. So in my mind, this is a much better term to talk about than assessments, really. And in fact, if you're familiar with the TEL framework, and if you're in a teacher program, you should be very familiar with it. That's exactly what they're calling it, right? They're calling it performance and feedback. I'm trying to answer that question. How do my students and I use performance and feedback to advance student learning? That seems to be a better description of what really happens when we give assessments, right? So when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about those 2 things, performance and feedback. Just as a preview, a couple of things. We're talking, of course, about performance assessments, or if you really fancy, integrated performance assessments. We're talking about external assessments. And some of you might even use external assessments in your program. And we're talking about checking for learning, right? When we're talking about feedback, we're talking about rubrics. In traditional program, probably not so much STARTALK program, we're also talking about, and I put in quotation mark, grades. It's not the greatest thing for feedback, but it's a form of feedback, and we can probably argue over the validity of it, but it's feedback for kids to some degree. And also that checking for learning, of course, is another opportunity for feedback. So we're going to talk about all these pieces. What I was trying to do is put all of those pieces together in a kind of a flow chart to demonstrate how they all connect when they happen in the learning process. So that's what I'm going to show you. And then we're going to take that and put the STARTALK lens on top of it and show you how each of those pieces happen in a STARTALK program. So how do you move from practice to performance? If you think about the idea of checking for learning, right? You all had to do it in the learning plan this year, correct? Remember that? Even teacher programs had to do it in the curriculum template, so we all had to do it, which hopefully at some point leads to some kind of formative assessment. I don't know, end of the week, end of the day, however their program is structured, and maybe at some point some kind of performance assessment as well. So we're thinking about those three types of, and I'm thinking about performance assessment as the summative one if you had to. But I know in STARTALK programs we don't really think about summative as much. I know that's what they're labeling it, but very few of us really do a true summative assessment. So I just changed it to performance assessment. But if you were to think of it outside of STARTALK, you could think of it as summative. Or if you have a university course, you could think of it as a summative assessment. So then I kind of thought about, okay, so those three types of assessments really happen at different times. They have different purposes, and they result in different reactions by the kids, correct? Checking for learning, how often should that happen? Constantly, every single day, correct? Yes, we do checking for learning every day, every class, every lesson, every learning episode. You had to do it right there in the learning plan. All right. What about formative assessment? Kind of the same, right? So I just put on there frequently because I'm thinking about these as slightly larger than those little daily learning checks, maybe after a couple days, or if you are in a day-long program, maybe at the end of the day, but something that incorporates a little bit more than just maybe an immediate learning episode. And then those performance assessments happen, I kind of put it at the end of unit, maybe at the end of your program, at the end of the class, whatever your program structure is or your context for teaching, right? So you have different frequencies and when those things are happening, okay? Now they also all have different purposes, correct? The purpose of checking for learning, in my mind, right, obviously is feedback, correct? That's why we're doing this. It's do you know if they got it before you move on? But I almost don't care. Can you tell? I don't like teachers all that much. I don't care about the feedback for you. I know it's important. I get it. But you know who this is actually really for? It's for the students, right? This may be the most important thing for them to have an aha moment of, I got this, right? So it's for both. It's obviously for students as well as for teachers. But I think the students' part is often discounted as how important that check for learning is. We view it as important for us if we can move on in the class, but it's really important for them as well. I was able to do this. I couldn't do this 15 minutes ago. I think I got this. Then when we're talking about that formative assessment, again, that's that slightly larger, not quite a performance assessment yet. In my mind, that's really the feed forward part, right? Because it's feeding forward in the sense that if your kids can do this well, they're probably going to be okay on that performance assessment. Because that formative assessment is just a small version of the performance assessment. Maybe it's 25%. It's half the scenario. It's a slightly different take on the scenario. But it's almost like that performance assessment. So if your students are doing well on that, you know they're probably going to be okay on this summative big assessment that you're going to do at the end of the week or the end of the course or the end of the program or whenever. But it's also great for the kids too, right? Because if they're doing well on this one, they're like, oh, she keeps saying we're going to do this big performance assessment. I'll be fine because I got this today. So again, it's kind of forecasting, foreshadowing what's going to happen. And then when you get to the performance assessment, it's both, right? It's feedback, of course, again, to you, but also, most importantly, the learner. We've done all this stuff for the last 2 weeks in this program, and look at what I can do now. Yay! Celebrate learning. But it's also feed forward because we know that performance leads to proficiency. So we know if the students are performing at whatever level of proficiency they're performing at, this doesn't mean that they are that level, but we're pretty certain that if this happens over and over and over again, eventually we can say they probably are that level of proficiency. So again, it's foreshadowing, forecasting, because performance leads to proficiency. So feedback, feed forward, both of them. So now we have the frequency, we have kind of the purpose of it, and then there's another category that I want to look at, kind of the result of it, or why are we doing this. And for me, when we talk about checking for learning, it's really, in most cases, it's just a recall thing, right? I mean, I just introduced no vocabulary, and we did some kind of processing activity that I'm using as my check for learning. And they're all going to do OK because, well, I just told them the words 20 times. So of course they did OK in the processing activity. I mean, they just heard it. They saw the pictures. They experienced it. They're going to be OK. But they don't really know these words. They can't do anything with those words yet. They're just recalling it. I mean, if I'd say a bunch of German words to you guys right now, you probably could recall them as well 5 minutes from now if I keep saying them over and over and over again and provide just some really comprehensive input, correct? So it's just recall. But it's OK. For the check for learning, that's all right. It's just the first stage. When we get to that formative assessment level, it's really about application, right? So all those things that they've been learning in their learning episodes, hopefully after multiple learning episodes, leads to some kind of form of application. They can not just recall them, but they can even do something with them in a tiny, teeny, tiny scenario. Not a full-blown assessment yet. And then when we get to that performance assessment, it's my hope, can't guarantee it, but of course it's my hope, it's that we're talking about ownership, right? And I put early in front of it because we know it's not true ownership. It is just a performance assessment. It's not proficiency yet, but certainly we're hoping for ownership at that level. So now here's a scenario that might be slightly different than the one we've been practicing the last, 5 days. But it's not really different. It's just slightly different. We just took a different person or a different country or a different city, but functionally we're asking you to do the exact same thing. Context is essentially the same thing. So we're hoping at that point we've gotten kids to some kind of early ownership. So now you can see 3 phases of assessment, different purposes, different frequencies, and different impact on the students. What do you think? Make sense? Questions? Comments? Yes? Yes, I'm glad you said that. Absolutely. I was hoping somebody would say that, because no, this is exactly what I was hoping for. Essentially, we would probably turn those arrows almost into like squiggly line, right? Not quite equal sign, but almost. Because yeah, of course, that checking for learning is essentially the same thing as that formative assessment, which is essentially the same as the performance assessment, right? So yeah, we expect all of these to be activities, and they're very, very similar, and the line is very blurry. Yeah, I think it's a great comment. Absolutely, yeah. So when we're talking about ownership, the reason I put that word on there because it's kind of a big deal, I think, in our field that we don't talk about. We've been talking about proficiency for a long time, but that word is so charged now, right? And we don't really understand what it means. And so I was like, can we just talk about language ownership? Because we all understand ownership, right? We want to not just rent a house, we want to own the house. And the same thing with the kid. We don't want them to just rent the language, we want them to own the language so they can use it for the rest of their life, correct? So when we're talking about language ownership, we are talking about language development, which would be more the literacy term, and we really are talking about proficiency. But if that's the focus, then some things have to happen in our programs to get kids to language ownership, right? In regular school problems, we have a language ownership huge problem. It's a gigantic problem because we never get kids there. kids get stuck at that novice high level for 3, 4 years. Guess what? We have the same problem in STARTALK. Right? Kids just get stuck at that novice level, and then they don't have anything. They come back, and they're still at the novice level. And I know it's not great that they only have Arabic instruction once a year for 3 weeks in the summer. I get it. But how can we help kids actually grow in their proficiency? How can we help them actually develop their language so that it leads to language ownership? And that's kind of the lens that I'm hoping we can bring when we're talking about assessment. All right, so let's talk about, so I want you to think like an assessor, right? That's a good thing. When we're thinking about, as a STARTALK teacher, we got to think like an assessor. I know you would like that, wouldn't you? Don't Google assessor images. There's some really interesting ones. So if we're taking this idea and putting now our STARTALK heads on, right? Because we all know all the different templates and processes that we have to complete as we're going through a STARTALK program, you're going to see lots of connections where this is actually happening, where we're already doing this, but you may not have thought about it. Or maybe you thought, like, why do we have to do that? Well, there's a real reason. I can show you the connections of why we want you to do those things at the different stages in the STARTALK process. All right, so let's look at that. Ugh, I forgot an animation, but that's OK. You can just sneak a peek. There's that model curriculum on Mulan, which some of you might have seen before, right? It's on the model curriculum website. And so we're talking about checking for learning, formative assessment, performance assessment. That checking for learning really comes from the learning target, doesn't it? Right? Because in your learning plan, you identify a learning target. And that formative assessment that you have to write is really comes from your program can-do statement, correct? And then you also have to write performance assessment, which really comes from your identified and assess for actual global benchmark, correct? Yes? So if we were looking at this example, take a look at this one. The learning target this is from Mulan, the sample or the model curricula, model learning plan. They have a learning target in one of the episodes. I just picked one and then try to backwards map it again, where it came from. I can give information about myself, including simple likes and dislikes. So that was the learning target for one particular learning episode in the learning plan, which came from that program can-do statement. I can ask and answer simple questions about family, animals, likes and dislikes, which came from the interpersonal global benchmark. I can communicate about very familiar topics using a variety of words and phrases that I have practiced and memorized. Doesn't always work out that way, but when I typed that, I was like, yes, look, it actually gets bigger too, every single step. It doesn't work. It's not always that nicely, but you can see how we started with a big benchmark and then it broke down all the way, right? So you have to actually do that when you do your planning. Now, to take another look at it from the assessment perspective, we do those checks for learning in the learning plan, correct? So for that learning target, the check for learning in the learning plan was individual learners comment on the various images on their self-portraits as the teacher circulates. Just a regular activity that happens. That was the check for learning for that learning target that you just saw. And that formative assessment planning happens in the curriculum template, stage 3, correct? That third column, we don't call it formative assessment. We call it what? Major evidence and whatever. There's another word behind it I forgot. But it's essentially, we're describing the formative assessments there, right? Not as small as a check for learning, not as big as the performance assessment, but some kind of major activity that happens maybe at the end of the day, end of the week, whatever. And so yeah, stage 3, column 3. In the curriculum you find this, learners create a collage of likes, dislikes using images representing things they can say and representing things that are important to them, such as pets. And then the performance assessment, where do you have to identify that in STARTALK? Stage 2 of the curriculum template, exactly. And when you go look at the Mulan one, you'll find there is indeed a performance assessment in interpersonal mode that reads, learners interview at least 2 other classmates about what kinds of pets, real or imagined, that they have. Now look at all 3 of those. Can you see the alignment? Can you see how it grows from just a check for learning to a formative to a performance assessment? And it's not just filling out a form, it's actually designed to help kids grow and build language ownership. It's all connected. So does everybody see how they all build onto each other? And how if students are successful and getting feedback on their check for learning, they'll be prepared very likely for the formative assessment. It wouldn't be the only check for learning, obviously, right? Because that's lesson planning. So there would probably, it's the only bad part, and there's a limit on how much I can get on a PowerPoint slide. There would probably be, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these, correct? And there will probably 2 or 3 of these, but only 1 of these. But if you do 10 of these, that will lead to 2 or 3 of these. Your students will be prepared for the one performance assessment that happens whenever it happens. Then I want to just go back to the idea of performance assessment, what that means, because I know we keep saying it. And the assumption is that everybody knows what it means, and some people have done a lot of work writing them. But what do they look like in the classroom? And also the idea that performance assessment can be more than just that big performance assessment at the end. So I'm going to show you a video of STARTALK teachers actually doing this in their classrooms. There are Russian teachers. Russian teachers. Yes, they're Russian teachers. And they didn't know we were coming. They kind of knew, but they weren't sure. They're mostly push-in teachers, so it's not their classroom, so it looks messy, so it's not pretty. But it's real life, right? Some kids don't do exactly what we ask them to do because it's real life. They didn't care there was a camera in there. But then we also had talked to the students, and we talked to the teachers why they were doing what they were doing, and they kind of did some reflections. So what I would like us to do is watch the video, kind of take notes in this 2-column fashion. What do you see, and what do you hear? And the C's obviously, right? What do you see on the screen? But then what do you hear? It's almost like that should have been 3 columns, because what do you hear happening in the classroom? But also, what do you hear the people talking about when they're reflecting on what's happening in the classroom? Because that's almost more important. Because listening to kids is always my favorite part to do, because they know exactly what's going on. We do not have them fooled like we think we do. So.
So what performance assessments really ask students to do is, whether they're doing an interpersonal or an interpretive or a presentational task, it's how do they take the language that they're learning and apply it to a real-world performance or context. What can I do with what I know? It's more important than just what do I know.
We use interpretive assessments, we use interpersonal assessments, and presentational assessments, because we are assessing our children on 3 different modes of communication.
When we do like act it out or do like the games when we have to like try to say it out by ourselves, and my teammates can help me like make sure I say it correctly.
Kids like to talk. Guess what? We're teaching a language. Let's talk in the target language.
When we have so many opportunities in a class to let students talk to each other, I make sure that they have a lot of that, so that when it comes time to assess, especially that crucial interpersonal piece, that they are comfortable and able.
It gives me feedback about where the students are, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, so what I need to help them move forward. That's targeting the can-do objective for the day.
We do performance assessments where students are giving a specific task. Let's say you're traveling to a foreign country and you don't speak any English and you are in the middle of Red Square in Russia. What do you do? How do you ask someone how to get to a museum?
Молодцы.
I use the data every day, every time I read over their writing, every time I hear them speak, and it really gives me a really powerful tool for adjusting the pace of my instruction.
Our elementary school teachers have created this ice cream cone parallel, where as you move up this proficiency or performance scale, it's aligned to color scoops of ice cream.
Green is just you're saying words. Blue is you're saying phrases.
Purple, you know a lot of sentences.
And then orange is when you speak all sentences and ask questions and answer.
Давайте всем подскажем. Лето. Я ношу. Ага, давайте вместе.
When you know where you are, you know how high you can go.
Gives me chills every single time. I mean, that's a third grader. And I didn't do the interviews. I was just in the back. But yeah, those kids, they just tell you everything. And it's amazing. We just had some very big questions, and I'm sitting there and he spits that and I was like, yes, we're using that quote. Because that's a pretty good quote, right? If you know, what did he say? If you know where you are, you know how you can go. That's a pretty powerful statement for a third grade student in a Russian class, I think. So I hope that what you saw in the video as well, and what I've been trying to get, and you started this already earlier, is the idea that every activity in a language classroom, allows for a check for learning, right? Every activity is a check for learning, which means, this is scary to some teachers, every activity is an assessment. You're assessing these kids too much. I'm like, yeah, that's right. And it's good, because it's a good assessment. It's performance assessment. It's okay. But every activity allows for a check for learning, which also means that every activity allows for a formative assessment, correct? It's nothing different. We're not stopping class like, oh, time for the formative assessment. It's just, they don't even have to know. Don't even label it. Just triggers all kinds of bad things in their mind. That word quiz, right? Comes out, whatever, even if you are saying formative assessment. And then if that's true, I mean, if we're saying that every activity allows for a check for learning, and every activity allows for formative assessment, that means every activity also should lead to a performance assessment, right? If not, why do it? It's very hard, because this means what I'm saying, that really fun, engaging activity that exposes the kids to all this cultural stuff, and they love it, and they have so much fun, and they smile, and they talk about it to their kids, their parents, and their friends. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. It's not leading to a performance assessment, that's right. That's hard, isn't it? Yeah, but if we want to see actual outcomes, and if we want to actually get kids to any level of language ownership, we've got to do that. I'm not saying don't do any of the stuff. We just got to figure out how can we embed some of those things into our activities, right? That's the key thing. It's not we're not doing any of it. It's just we're not doing it separately in addition to. We got to figure out how can you integrate it. And then also think about maybe some of the stuff could wait a little longer till they have a little more developed, more language. Because this is what we're after. We are after that idea of language ownership. Okay. Whew. We okay? Still with me? Yes? All right. One more planning, thinking process to kind of get you to think like an assessor And hopefully you'll take this back when you have to fill out your curriculum templates next year, because you'll see the connections in all the elements of the curriculum template. And that's how do you start? How do you then actually do that backwards design with the assessment head on all the time? Because the piece is all there, but again, you have to kind of remember to go through those processes. Go away, go away. Okay, so how do we plan for language ownership? Because it doesn't just happen by itself, we have to actually plan for it, right? Okay, so this is kind of it's not a template, it's just to kind of think about it, because you have to do it more than on one page. But just kind of walk through with me. So let's say our proficiency target for our program is novice mid. Lots of STARTALK programs have that as their proficiency target. And so now that we have that, we can go and pick our global benchmark, right? And now in the new curriculum template, it's built right in. You just click on it and you choose it. You don't even have to look it up. And so I'm going to pick one for interpersonal, because I like interpersonal, obviously. Kids like interpersonal. They want to talk. Let's give them a chance to talk, right? And so here's one for novice mid, interpersonal. Not one, the one benchmark. Students communicate on very familiar topics using a variety of words and phrases that have been practiced and memorized. Well, that's a lot. It's going to take a long time to get kids there. So in your template, you now have to identify a program can do, right? It's supposed to incorporate your theme and everything else. So I could say, I can discuss with someone what I do all day at camp. So talk about all my favorite activities that I like to do in camp in some kind of interpersonal scenario. I could then probably write a performance assessment for that, would be stage 2 of the curriculum. Nope, nope, nope. That's just, yeah. Talk about, discuss, ask and answer questions. I mean, whatever favorite word you want to use there. Yeah. So then we could probably, but we could write a scenario that would allow students to demonstrate that they can do that, right? So scenario would be maybe you meet a new whatever language speaking student on your way home from summer camp, and she's interested in, and you tell blah, 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 blah. You discuss, talk about, ask and answer questions, all the favorite things that you did at camp. Well, that doesn't happen overnight, correct? That's going to take a lot of work. It's a nice little scenario at the end, right? Exactly, yeah. And so now we have to figure out, if so that's our scenario, then we have to figure out what are the formative assessments that could help students be prepared for this large performance assessment. So and these are not right or wrong, they're just a couple of examples, but they could create some kind of questionnaire as a formative assessment, where they maybe first they just create it, and maybe they actually use it to find out what different people in their class, in their group, whatever setup you have. They could maybe even summarize their favorite and least favorite activities in an infographic. And they're doing all of these things because it's going to help them be prepared for that performance assessment. They're going to get feedback on all of those things. And it's going to, if they can do that well, we know they'll probably be okay on that performance assessment. Again, that's stage 3, third column, right, of the curriculum template. And then you give it to your teachers and have them do lesson plans. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say that word anymore. Learning plans. That's when you then come up with learning targets, and I just started. I mean, there could be 10, 15, 20, depending on how many learning episodes you end up writing. But, you know, it's probably going to start with some input activities where you probably just, they don't just come in and say the words on their own, right? So I have things like I can identify camp activities when listening to somebody talk about camp. I can categorize different activities in a reading. I can state my favorite activity. It could be stating and writing, could be stating and talking. And then eventually there'll be more and more activities that all scaffold back to that form of assessment, which scaffolds back to our performance assessment, which was the indicator of the benchmark of the proficiency target that we had actually set for the program. You talked about it earlier. about the idea of backwards design, but I'm not right in what you said. I won't say what else you said, but you talked about backwards design. This is backwards design, actually, isn't it? Right? This is kind of the process that we're asking you to go through when you fill out the curriculum template. And you can see all the elements of assessment that keep popping up every single time. What I'm hoping is that when you read it now, or when you fill it out now, and you look at it like an assessor, you look at it slightly different. It's not just about, oh, I only have 2. Shouldn't we have like 3? Because I get that question all the time from like, how many should we be supposed to put in there? However many it takes for the kids to be prepared, right? So think about it this way when you fill out the curriculum template. Because that's really what you're doing. It's just you're following a different, kind of flow slightly different. But essentially this is what you're being asked to think about as you're filling out the curriculum template. Questions, comments? Well, and I'm glad you said that word, real life, right? Oh, well, kind of somebody said, we were talking about that it's real life, having assessments that are real life, which is very motivating to the students, personalized. Yeah, and that's very true. And it's more than just saying it, right? Because it's a great buzzword, personalizing real world. But what does it actually mean? What does it really look like? You can do this. And in a STARTALK program, you really can do it because you have some luxuries that often regular year-round programs don't have, right? I mean, if you're doing real-life performance assessment, they shouldn't start with the words imagine. If your real-life performance assessment starts with the word imagine, it is no longer real life, correct? So if you want them to talk to other people, have them talk to other people, like real-life people. If you want them to, I mean, and a lot of STARTALK programs do a real nice job with it. I think that's probably one of the strengths, that we can create those kind of real-life assessment opportunities for the kids. And then they don't even feel like assessments anymore because it's just, they don't even feel like performance. It's just doing, which is great. That's exactly what we want. Yeah, great comment. Good. Okay. That's all I have, which is good. You guys have been probably the nicest STARTALK audience ever. You always say that. No, I don't always say that. Trust me. No, because there's always someone in the crowd who wants to ask like this random question that has nothing to do with it, but they want to be heard. And there was nobody here like this today, so it's kind of nice. But I hope I'm kind of reminding you again that it's okay. Assessment is not a bad thing. It's a good thing to help our kids move from practice to performance, and really, if we add it to that title, of course, eventually to proficiency, or what I like to call language ownership. So thank you. Now you got extra free time. How long are you?